She never told anyone her real name. That was the first thing the journalist noticed when he arrived at her door in the autumn of 1884. Notebook trembling in his cold hands, ink already freezing at the tip of his pen. She simply called herself Marin. Just Marin. No family name offered, no history volunteered. She lived alone in a stone house at the edge of Gallipolis, Ohio, perched above the river like something the earth had grown rather than something human hands had built. She was old. Impossibly, stubbornly old. The kind of old that makes people uncomfortable, because it suggests a life that has witnessed things they were never meant to know. The journalist's name was Edmund Rourke, a minor correspondent for the Portsmouth Daily Times, and he had ridden 3 hours in the rain to find her. He had heard the rumors. Everyone in the valley had heard the rumors, but nobody talked about them openly. Not anymore, because talking about what Marin had seen meant talking about the giants. And the giants, the people of the Ohio Valley had quietly agreed, were better left forgotten. Let us go back further. Let us go back to before the forgetting, to the years when the valley was still trying to understand what it had found buried inside itself. It was the 1840s when farmers first started turning them up. A femur near Chillicothe so long it reached a grown man's shoulder. A jaw discovered outside of Marietta, wide enough to place both fists inside. Skulls unearthed along creek banks with brow ridges like shelving rock, with eye sockets so deep and dark they looked less like bone and more like doorways. The men who found these things did not immediately run to newspapers. They were practical people, frontier people, and their first instinct was simply to be confused. But confusion gave way to something else when the measurement started. 7 feet. 7.5. In one documented case, a skeleton recovered from a burial mound near the Kanawha River that stretched, by multiple witnesses' accounts, to nearly 8 feet and 3 inches in length. These were not the bones of ordinary men. These were not even the bones of large men. These were something else entirely, something the valley had swallowed and kept secret for centuries beneath its soft, dark soil. The Smithsonian Institution took notice. So did local historians. So did newspaper editors who smelled the kind of story that sold papers for weeks. Expeditions were organized. Mounds were opened. More bones were cataloged, measured, sketched, and in many cases shipped eastward to institutions and museums, where several of them were never seen again, at least not by the public. But before all of that institutional machinery began grinding over the evidence, before the academics arrived with their careful language and their tendency to reduce impossible things into manageable theories, there were the people who had always known, and the one who knew best was a woman named Marin. Edmund Rourke had been given her name by an elderly ferryman in Point Pleasant who had gone pale when the journalist mentioned the bones. The ferryman had looked around the dock as though checking for listeners, then leaned close and said, low and almost without breath, that if he truly wanted to understand what had been found in these hills, he needed to find the old woman above the river who had grown up among people who still remembered. Remembered what Rourke had pressed. The ferryman had only shaken his head and turned back to his ropes. So Rourke had ridden north, following the river, asking carefully worded questions at taverns and general stores, until a blacksmith's wife in a small settlement outside of Gallipolis had pointed without speaking toward a stone house on a hill. She had pointed and then gone back inside and closed her door firmly behind her, as though even indicating the direction carried some consequence she did not wish to invite. Rourke had stood in the autumn rain and looked up at that house for a long time before he climbed toward it. Marin answered the door before he knocked. She stood in the frame, wrapped in a dark wool shawl, her white hair loose around a face that was more geography than flesh, a landscape of deep lines and weathered terrain that suggested decades of outdoor life, of seasons taken directly without shelter or softening. Her eyes were the color of creek water in November, clear and still and carrying something underneath. She looked at him with no particular surprise. "You're about the bones," she said. It was not a question. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something herbal Rourke could not name. The walls were hung with dried plants, with handmade tools, with objects he could not immediately identify. He noticed that she moved through the space with the practiced ease of a person who had lived alone for a very long time, not with loneliness, but with a deep familiarity with her own company. She poured him something hot without asking if he wanted it and sat across from him at a table worn smooth by decades of use. And then she began to speak. What Rourke recorded that afternoon would eventually be published in a small regional edition of the Portsmouth Daily Times in the spring of 1885, buried deep in the paper's interior pages, sandwiched between a livestock advertisement and a notice about a church social. It ran without illustration and without the editor's endorsement. A brief prefatory note described Rourke's interview as the recollections of an elderly woman of uncertain origin regarding local folklore. The dismissal was deliberate, because what Marin had told him was not, by any comfortable definition, folklore. She had been born, she said, in the first decade of the 19th century, in a river settlement that no longer existed, washed out in a flood long enough ago that even the name of it had become uncertain in her memory. Her mother's people had been in the valley since before memory had formal language for itself. They had not been European. They had not been part of any of the recognized tribal nations whose histories were already being systematically erased by the expansion of the young republic. They were something older, something smaller in number, something that had persisted in the margins and the hidden places of the valley like water persists in deep stone, invisibly, stubbornly, because it simply has no other option. Her mother's people had a name for the ones who had left the bones. The name translated roughly, Marin said, and she paused here for a long time, looking at her hands in her lap, as though translating not just language, but weight, as something close to the ones who kept the sky with their heads. They had not been monsters in any story her people told about them. They had not been gods. They had been people. Enormous. Yes, strange in proportion. Yes, but people nonetheless, with settlements and customs and ways of marking time. Her people's oldest memories described them not with fear, but with something closer to reverence mixed with sorrow, the specific grief of one group watching another group reach its final days. Because the giants, Marin told Rourke, had already been dying when her people's oldest ancestors had known them. Already reduced to their last communities, already weakened by something no story fully named. Possibly disease, possibly the slow grinding of centuries, possibly simply the exhaustion of outlasting everything you have ever known. The mounds were not mysteries to her people. The mounds were graves. Careful, deliberate, loving graves built by the last of the giants for each other as they went. Rourke's notes from this portion of the interview grow cramped and hurried, as though his hand could not keep pace with what he was hearing. He records that Marin described specific mounds in specific locations, several of which, when he later checked against published survey records, corresponded exactly to documented archaeological sites. She named the general orientations of burial arrangements, the presence of certain types of stone tools, the practice of placing red ochre around the remains, details that were not commonly known and that match subsequent excavation findings with an accuracy that Rourke found, as he later wrote in a letter to a colleague that was preserved among that colleague's papers, deeply and inexplicably precise. She told him about the last one her people had encountered. Not a community this time, but a single individual, a woman, very old, found living alone in a rock shelter in the hills east of the river. Encountered by Marin's great-grandmother in what she calculated was probably around the time of the Revolutionary War. The giant woman had been near death when found, barely moving, wrapped in coverings that had long since rotted to fibers around her. Marin's great-grandmother had stayed with her, had brought her food and water, and had remained beside her until the end. And before the end, Marin said, the old giant woman had spoken, not in any language her great-grandmother knew, but she had spoken, and her great-grandmother had listened, and had carried that sound, that final voice, that last language of a people reduced to a single dying elder in a hillside shelter, carried it the only way she could, not as words but as music, as a tone, as a kind of humming that held the shape of what had been said without the meaning, because meaning had crossed some boundary that could not be followed. Marin hummed it for Rourke there in the warm stone house above the river. He wrote in his notes that he could not transcribe it. He wrote that it sounded like wind through rock and like something weeping and like a question being asked in a language he would never speak. He wrote in an aside that he crossed out and then rewrote that he felt while she hummed a sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous and dark and irretrievably gone. He crossed it out again in the final published version. His editor would not have kept it. Here is where the story bends toward the burning. When Rourke's article appeared in the spring of 1885, small and buried as it was, it found a reader it was not intended to find. A man named Harrington, a regional administrator with connections to a larger institution that was at that time actively involved in shaping the official narrative around the mound builders and their remains, came across the piece while traveling through Portsmouth on business. He made inquiries. He learned where Rourke was based. He called on Rourke personally, which was unusual enough to unsettle the journalist, and asked, with the carefully maintained pleasantness of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through manner rather than force, for the complete interview notes. Rourke refused. He later wrote about this encounter in a private journal, saying that the man's particular form of politeness had frightened him more than outright anger would have. There was something in it, Rourke wrote, that felt like weather felt before a storm, that specific quality of the air going very still. Harrington left without the notes, but within 2 months, Rourke's small apartment above the printing office where he worked had been entered and searched. The interview notes were not taken. This confused Rourke until he understood why, because what was taken instead were his correspondence files, the letters he had written to colleagues about the interview, the letters in which he had described Marin's name and general location. The notes without context were perhaps less useful than the map to the source. He rode back to Gallipolis as quickly as he could arrange it. He arrived in late summer of 1885. The stone house above the river was empty, not abandoned in the ordinary sense, not left in haste with belongings scattered, but simply empty, cleared with a thoroughness that suggested careful and intentional departure. The dried plants gone from the walls, the tools gone, the table swept clean, the hearth cold in a way that suggested it had been cold for some time. The blacksmith's wife, who had pointed without speaking toward the house, would not answer her door when Rourke knocked. The ferryman at Point Pleasant had left his work, no one knew where. The small community of people who had, with their silences and their pointed fingers and their quickly closed doors, formed an invisible boundary around Marin's knowledge, had pulled that boundary closed. Rourke went back to Portsmouth. He tried twice more to publish expanded versions of his account, once with a regional press and once with a Philadelphia journal that had expressed initial interest. Both times the pieces were declined, the first with a form letter and the second with a personal note from an editor who suggested, in language carefully calibrated to sound like editorial judgment rather than pressure, that the material was not sufficiently documented for serious consideration. He kept his private journal until his death in 1902. His daughter donated it to a local historical society in 1931, where it sat uncatalogued for decades. A local history enthusiast found it in the 1970s, recognized what it was, wrote a brief paper about it for a regional publication with a small circulation, and died before he could pursue the matter further. The journal itself passed through several private collections before its current location, which is a matter of some dispute among the small community of researchers who know it exists. What remains is this: an incomplete interview, a woman named Marin, a stone house above the Ohio River, long since collapsed or demolished, its stones perhaps used for other walls, for other foundations, its particular history absorbed into the general indifference of time, a hum that cannot be written down, a language that has no living speaker, a people described in the oldest stories of a people who themselves barely survived, remembered now only as the enormous shadows they left inside the earth. And the question that Rourke wrote in his journal on the last night he spent trying to find Marin again, a question he never answered, a question that his daughter found in the margins of his notes and underlined twice with a pencil line that has faded but not disappeared. He wrote, "What did she hear in that hillside in the hills east of the river? And what has been done to keep us from hearing it too? And what are we truly without the things we have been made to forget?" Marin was the last person alive who carried the echo of that final voice, the last link in a chain that stretched back to a humanity larger and stranger and more ancient than the one we were taught to recognize. She did not want to be found. And then she was found. And then, with whatever quiet urgency moves through the lives of people who understand the weight of what they carry, she was gone. Somewhere in the Ohio Valley, in soil that has been farmed and built upon and flooded and rebuilt for nearly 2 centuries, the bones are still there. The ones that were not shipped to institutions. The ones that were not lost in archival reshufflings. The ones that no expedition ever reached. They are patient in the way that the very old are patient, in the way that anything which has already outlasted everything it loved is patient. They do not need us to remember them. They have been waiting long enough to know that memory, like water, finds its way eventually through every barrier built against it. But there was a woman who hummed their language in a warm stone house above a cold river in 1884. And for one afternoon, at a table worn smooth by decades of solitary use, the sound of something utterly vanished was briefly, tremblingly alive again. And that, if nothing else, deserves to be carried forward by someone. Even if that someone is only you, hearing it now, for the very first time.